Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this MFSQL connector using the context menu for third-party integrations webinar. Let's start off and ask ourselves, what does MFSQL connector actually do? MFSQL connector is a database connectivity tool. It provides seamless synchronization between M files and SQL both ways, using the power of SQL without having to resort to M files APIs to program such an synchronization or integration. It's targeted at businesses who want to get the most out of their information in M files by accessing and interacting with the metadata using SQL. Now, it's important to recognize that this is a tool that is for SQL users. It provides the control over a multi-layered processing and transfer of M-files object information, whether it is for reporting, data manipulation, or managing the data between M-files and other business systems. So, what is the context menu? It is a subset of the connector. Basically, it allows either a user or an event in M files to trigger a SQL operation. And this is operational both in on a cloud vault and on-premise vaults. It does this by the concept of an action. So either a user can select from a menu an option, and these options are very customizable, to select an operation that they want to complete. Or alternatively, it doesn't have to be user-based. This action can also be activated by a workflow change or an event handler. And what is more important is that this action could actually use the object-related information, therefore hence context menu. So it can identify the object and use that object metadata in the processing in the SQL procedure, or it can effectively just perform a generic operation that is not specific to that particular object. Just to emphasize that the context menu is available both in the data exchange module, i.e. for reporting and just just exchanging to and fro from between M files and SQL, or it is also a core component for operations where we are performing integration. And I think the best is to perhaps illustrate this with a couple of examples. So the first example that I want to highlight is where it is user controlled. So a user actually wants to start a background operation. For example, the user is involved in completing the documentation associated with a vendor, all the contracts, supporting documents, additional evaluations that need to take place within the organization for a vendor to be approved. And then at the point in time where the user then believes that he has done all of the preparatory work for that vendor, they want to start a SQL procedure which will then pull all the information from the vendor, pull the documentation, supporting documentation, evaluate that to see whether it's complete, whether all the documents that is expected is there, whether the metadata, maybe it needs separate approval, maybe it needs to be above a certain level, all those type of things that need to be included in the metadata of the supporting documents or the vendor. And then once it has actually passed that approval, then it changes the vendor state so that it then can be submitted for approval. So the key here is that the user has the ability to signal when this evaluation process needs to take place. And the type of evaluation is an open book. You can do any types of evaluations that need to take place. And you have the power of SQL to effectively pull all the related information from M files, evaluate it, and then effectively result in a further action. The next illustration that I wanted to use is where the users are involved in something like work order management, and so they are constantly busy changing work orders into different states, and take them through the daily operations. But the management want to have a report on a regular basis, almost immediately, to see what is the workflow status of all these work orders, which ones is outstanding today, how many has been completed, what is it, what is the team focusing on, and so forth. But the key to this example is that they want to pretty much immediately know what has changed in the objects. And in this particular case, where the context menu comes into place is that we use a context menu that is activated by an event handler after checking changes. And the moment that the user actually checks the workflow, the work order in, it updates the table in SQL, and voila, they have a pretty up-to-date report that management can digest. The third opportunity which I want to highlight is one where the operation is such that you want to have an action to take place at a particular stage. So the example that I'm working on here is that you have a opportunity, and as that opportunity matures, it gets to a state that it's won, and then when it is won, it needs to effectively create the customer related to that opportunity in the ERP system. So this is done by using a state change context menu action. And so when the opportunity is won, the system will automatically trigger a SQL procedure. The SQL procedure will get the information from the opportunity, check whether the customer already exists or not, and if it does exist, it would push that information to the ERP system.
Before we start with the actions, let me first start by showing you around the menus. So when MFiles opens and the user have access to MFSQL, they can action a button in the taskbar to show a menu in the window. Now this menu is fully customizable. The headings for the menus as well as the action names can be organized by you. This is all done through a SQL setup table where you specify the menu headings and the action names and then the underlying store procedure that will be called by that. There is also another functionality, and that is where you select an object and then right-click the object. There is a menu then for MFSQL Connector, and then when you click on that button, it then returns the details of that particular object, and it also will then activate the actions that is specifically for object-orientated actions that can be performed on this particular menu. Again, I want to emphasize that the actions itself is also security protected, and therefore, you can determine who should and could actually perform a particular action. The first scenario that I would like to illustrate is where we are updating the supplier address in or other property in MFiles, and we want to push that update into the ERP system. So let's make a change to the vendor, save it, and the expectation now is that this change has actually taken place into ERP. So let's check it out. The way that we can access the ERP system is also a feature of the context menu, whereby if I use the menu, I can actually add a link to any website or external source as part of my menus. So I'm just using that feature by accessing this link. The link takes me to my ERP system, and in this case, I actually have just a small database with some suppliers and customers in SQL that I can access. So let's search for that vendor and go and check it out. When I look at the vendor, I can see that it has been updated. What I want to do next is to select another vendor and then make a change in ERP on the address. So if I now make a change in ERP, and let's just take those that part of the address out, and let's note that we are using Tokyo traders. We send it, we update it in the ERP, and go back to MFiles, search for Tokyo to find the vendor in MFiles. And if we look at it, we will notice that the change that we've made in ERP has not yet taken place. And that is because the option that I want to illustrate in this particular scenario is that I want to use the menu to effectively go and update that from ERP. So I want to pull from ERP on demand, and I do that by using a context-sensitive update menu. Use the action button for updating the vendor. What that button does, it actually creates the SQL procedure that then pull this entry from ERP into MFiles. And if I now look at my vendor again, I can see the version has been updated and my change has taken place. In the next method that I want to illustrate, I want to create a new vendor, and as part of the vendor approval process, we want to ensure that the new vendor is at the right time being created into the ERP system. So let's first create the vendor and then progress this vendor through to in the approval process to allow it to get to a place where the vendor is approved, and then the interaction with SQL can take place at a particular point in the process. So we've now progressed it to the review process. If we go to SQL, we will, or to the ERP system, we'll see that the new vendor is not yet in the ERP system because it has not yet created that item. So the whole intent is that it would only create the new vendor once the object has been approved, and then it can check for the creation of it. So let's continue down the workflow processes. So effectively, this vendor is now ready for approval. We can now get to the approving of the item. Let's just select the assignment and approve the assignment. And we approve both of the items to ensure that the approval goes through and is processed by the workflow rules. If we now go and look at the vendor, and it has actually moved on to to vendor approved. Now, what is important is that when the object reaches the stage vendor approved, it fires a SQL procedure based upon the workflow change and create the new vendor, and we can see the new vendor in ERP. So this illustrates the workflow action-based call for a SQL procedure to go and create that object in the third-party system. What I would now like to do is take you through the technical journey of how the three options that I've shown you, menu-based, event handler-based, and workflow state-based, how those are being set up and arranged within the backend system. So first, let me start off the MFSQL admin. And within the MFSQL admin, the setups are being done. We are working with the MFSQL demo vault. We are using an after checking changes event. And if you go and look at the code for it, then in the code, there is a code snippet that we can provide to you. And the only real item that is important to change in this is the reference to the external method that it then calls, from based upon the parameters that it is passing through. The only change that you need to make is to actually use the action name that is particular to this particular action. So there you can see where the action name are inserted into the script. The whole process is governed by a table within the MFSQL Connector database, which is called the MF Context Menu. The MF Context Menu would carries all of the parameters of the entries that is being called from mfiles where it is actually calling SQL. You'll notice that one of the entries in this table is for this vendor event action. This is the name that we put into the script. This calls a procedure, the custom update ERP vendor. And if you now go and look at the store procedures, then you'll see that there is a store procedure custom update ERP vendor. And if we go a little bit deeper into this procedure, first of all, it's important to note that all of the procedures that is actually called by the context menu need to have these parameters, and it need to be in a fixed order. So all of the parameters is required, and they must not be changed in terms of the sequence that they're in the procedure. The other parameters that you set up is particular to that particular process that you want to set up. Important to note that one of the key things always to do when you call a procedure is to update the record from mfiles to SQL. And in this particular illustration, we actually have two methods set up. One when there is no object passed through. The other one method is used when there is an object that is passed through. And then we call and we update the specific record, in this case, to update the vendor from mfiles to SQL. And then we use another statement to basically push the changes in this object to the ERP system. The rest of the procedure has some logging and debugging code, which I'm not going to deal with in any particular detail in this particular video. If I now go and talk you a little bit through the second method that we are using for in this video, you would remember that is the call from the vendor when it reaches a particular state. Then it fires. So let's go and look at the workflow. The workflow for the vendors. It's the vendor approval flow, and on the vendor approved state, as it goes through this process, when it gets to the approved state, it fires a script. It's exactly a similar script to the one that I've shown you in the event handler, except that this time around the action name is different. There we have an action name called new vendor action. So this particular procedure is then, or an entry in the context menu is then called. There you can see that this is the entry in the context menu, and it would call the custom new ERP vendor procedure. If I look at the particular procedure, you'll see again it has exactly the same parameters, but the contents of the procedure is different. I again would call and update the item from mfiles into SQL so that I have it in SQL, and then I will then use the procedure to make the update for creating a new vendor in the ERP system, which is a procedure that would depend on your particular ERP system and the way that updates takes place into your ERP system. The final method that I have illustrated is based upon a menu. This is where we've made the change in ERP, and we want to pull that by way of a menu into mfiles. So again, this is based upon the context menu. So if I go and look at the context menu, I can see that the context menu also provides us with the capability of setting up any number of actions. There's two action types that refer to menu-based actions. That is an action type 1 and an action type 3. And action type 1 is not context sensitive. Action type 3 is context sensitive. There you can see that we have the vendor update item for which is context sensitive. That will call this do vendor update procedure. It's linked to the update menu heading, and that is what this setup does, so that you can see that you have menu headings and it's organized in a particular way so that you can have all of the actions. And if you click on the action, then it would actually fire the item. And in a similar way, if it is context sensitive, then you have a little bit of a different menu that actually works in exactly the same way. It just has a different action type 3 that's related to it, to fire the underlying procedure that is being called by this particular menu item.
This brings us to the close of our practical demonstration. I would like to highlight that on this site, doc.lamininsolutions.com, you'll find the documentation for the connector, and in the documentation, if you search on context menu, you'll find a whole variety of different references with regard to the use and the updating of the context menu and the different parts of it. I would like to highlight the installation of the context menu in particular, to actually get it installed, and also the using the context menu. In this using of the context menu, you'll get detailed instructions in terms of how to set up the menus, the workflow state usage, the different parameters, how you actually call the different actions. You will also find some sample procedures in this section, and then finally you'll find the event handler scripting for the event handler and the workflow state, so that you can incorporate it into your either event handler or your action script for the workflow. So hopefully this documentation would take you through further detail in terms of the procedures, what the procedures are used for, how to create it, some sample procedures that you can start off with and use the system for your, to set up the system for your use. Laminin Solutions, the originator for the MFSQL Connector plugin, have been an MFiles partner since 2009. We have offices in the UK and in Florida, and our development team is in India. We deploy MFiles as well as other products like Epicor and Interject. A little bit about MFSQL Connector. It was originated in 2012. It was because of popular demand by many resellers. It became a product in 2016, and since then it has gone through multiple upgrades to extend the functionality and provide more depth in the product. And finally, here you can get our contact details to get in touch if you require any further information. I trust that you've enjoyed the webinar, and that we will hear from you soon.